Hey guys, today we're going to read an Apparel Factory defies sweatshop label, but can it thrive? This is source number 2 on your researcher's notebook, and it is written by Stephen Greenhouse. Please make sure that you start by unraveling your article. So go ahead and start by underlining your title, by putting your cursor over and clicking up here on the U and coming off to the side. And don't forget to use a complete sentence. I predict this article will be about. After you've made your prediction, you need to go ahead and highlight words that you think will be important in the text. Go ahead and pause so you can take care of that. Next, go ahead and grab your researcher's notebook and turn to source number 2. You need to go ahead and write the title for your source title, An Apparel Factory Defies Sweatshop Label, But Can It Thrive? Your author is Stephen Greenhouse. The publisher is the New York Times. And it was written on July 17th, 2010. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and read. We're on paragraph number 1. Sitting in her tiny living room here, Santa Castillo beams about the new house that she and her husband are building directly behind the wooden shack where they now live. The new home will be 4 times bigger with 2 bedrooms and an indoor bathroom. The couple and their 3 children now share a windowless bedroom and rely on an outhouse 2 doors away. Mrs. Castillo had long dreamed of a bigger, sturdier house, but 3 months ago something happened that finally made it possible. She landed a job at one of the world's most unusual garment factories. Industry experts say it is a pioneer in the developing world because it pays a living wage, in this case 3 times the average pay of the country's apparel workers, and allows workers to join a union without a fight. We never had the opportunity to make wages like this before, says Mrs. Castillo, a soft-spoken woman who earns $500 a month. I feel blessed. The factory is a high-minded experiment, a response to appeals from myriad university officials and student activists that the garment industry stop using poverty wage sweatshops. It has 120 employees and is owned by Knights Apparel, a privately held company based in Spartanburg, South Carolina, that is the leading supplier of college logo apparel to American universities, according to the Collegiate Licensing Company. For Knights, the factory is a risky proposition, even though it already has orders to make t-shirts and sweatshirts for bookstores at 400 American universities. The question is whether students, alumni, and sports fans will be willing to pay $18 for the factory's t-shirts, the same as premium brands like Nike and Adidas, to sustain the plant and its generous wages. Paragraph 6. Joseph Botchitz, the CEO of Knights, is optimistic. We're hoping to prove that doing good can be good business, that they're not mutually exclusive, he says. Not everyone is so confident. It's a notable effort, but it is an experiment, says Andrew Jackson, an industry consultant who says fair labor garments face a limited market unless deft promotion can snare consumers' attention and conscience. They are consumers who really care and will buy this apparel at a premium price, he says. And then there are those who say they care, but then just want value. Mr. Botchitz says the plant's t-shirts and sweats should command a premium because the company uses high-quality fabric, design, and printing. In the factory's previous incarnation, a Korean-owned company, BG&B, made baseball caps for Nike and Reebok before shutting it in 2007 and moving the operation to a lower-wage country. Today, the reborn factory is producing under a new label, Alta Gracia, named after this poverty-ridden town. Alta Gracia translates to exalted grace. This sometimes seems too good to be true, says James Wilkerson, Duke University's Director of Licensing and a leader of American University's Fair Labor Movement. He said a few other apparel companies have tried to improve working conditions like Schoolhouse, which was founded by a 25-year-old Duke graduate and uses a factory in Sri Lanka. Worker advocates applaud these efforts, but many say Alta Gracia has gone farther than others by embracing higher wages and unionization. A living wage is generally defined as the amount of money needed to adequately feed and shelter a family. What really counts is not what happens with this factory over the next 6 months, Mr. Wilkerson says. It's what happens 6 years or 10 years from now. We want badly for this to live on. Santa Castillo agrees. She and many co-workers toiled at the other factories for the minimum wage, currently $147 a month in this country's free trade zones, where most apparel factories are located. That amount, worker after worker lamented in interviews for this article, falls woefully short of supporting a family. The Alta Gracia family has pledged to pay employees nearly 3.5 times the prevailing minimum wage, based on a study done by a workers' rights group that calculated the living costs for a family of 4 in the Dominican Republic. While some critics view the living wage as do-gooder mumbo-jumbo, Mrs. Castillo views it as a godsend. In her years earning the minimum wage, she said she felt stuck on a treadmill, never able to advance, often borrowing to buy necessities. A lot of time there was only enough for my kids, and I'd go to bed hungry, she says. But now I have money to buy meat, oatmeal, and milk. With higher wages, she says, her family can move up in the world. She is now able to borrow $1,000 to begin building her future home and feels able to fulfill her dreams of becoming a minister at her local evangelical church. I hope God will continue to bless the people who brought this factory to our community, she says. In many ways, the factory owes its existence to an incident a decade ago when Joe Bosich was attending his son's high school basketball game. His vision suddenly became blurred, and he could hardly make out his son on the court. A day later, he couldn't read. A doctor told him the only thing that would cause his vision to deteriorate so rapidly was a brain tumor. So he went in for an MRI. My doctor said, the good news is you don't have a brain tumor, but the bad news is you have multiple sclerosis, he says. For 3 days, he couldn't see. He worried that he would be relegated to a wheelchair and ventilator and wouldn't be able to support his family. At the same time, a close friend and his brother died, and then one of his children began suffering from anxiety. I thought of people who were going through the same thing as my child and me, Mr. Bosich recalls. Fortunately, we had the resources for medical help, and I thought of all the families that didn't. I started thinking I wanted to do something more important with my business than worry just about winning market share, he adds. That seemed kind of empty after what I'd been through. I wanted to find a way to use my business to impact people that it touched on a daily basis. He regained his full vision after 3 weeks and says he hasn't suffered any further attacks. Shortly after Mr. Bosich recovered, Knights Apparel set up a charity, We Care, that supports a home for orphans and abused children, but he says he wanted to do more. A national collegiate bodybuilding champion at Vanderbilt, Mr. Bosich was hired by Gold's Gym after graduation and later found a unit in the company that sold Gold's apparel to outside retailers. Building on that experience, Mr. Bosich started Knights Apparel in 2000. Still solidly built at 47, he has made apparel deals with scores of universities, enabling Knights to surpass Nike as the #1 college supplier. Under Mr. Bosich, Knights cooperates closely with the Workers' Rights Consortium, a group of 186 universities that press factories making college logo apparel to treat workers fairly. Scott Nova, the consortium's executive director, says Mr. Bosich seems far more committed than most other apparel executives to stamping out abuses, like failure to pay for overtime work. Knights contracts with 30 factories worldwide. At a meeting that the two men had in 2005 to address problems at a Philippines factory, Mr. Bosich floated the idea of opening a model factory. Mr. Nova loved the idea. He was frustrated that most apparel factories worldwide still paid the minimum wage or only a fraction above, rarely enough to lift families out of poverty. Minimum wages are 15 cents an hour in Bangladesh and around 85 cents in the Dominican Republic and many cities in China. The Alta Gracia factory pays $2.83 an hour. Mr. Bosich first considered opening a factory in Haiti, but was dissuaded by the country's poor infrastructure. Mr. Nova urged him to consider this depressed community, hoping that he would employ some of the 1,200 people thrown out of work when the Korean-owned Cat factory closed. Mr. Bosich turned to a longtime industry executive, Donnie Hodge, a former executive with J.P. Stevens, Milliken, and Gerber Children's Wear. Overseeing a $500,000 renovation of the factory, Mr. Hodge, now president of Knights, called for bright lighting, 5 sewing lines, and pricey ergonomic chairs, which many seamstresses thought were for the managers. We could have given the community a check for $25,000 or $50,000 a year and felt good about that, Mr. Hodge said, but we wanted to make this a sustainable thing. The factory's biggest hurdle is self-imposed, how to compete with other apparel makers when its wages are so much higher. Mr. Bosich says the factory's costs will be $4.80 a shirt, 80 cents or 20% more than if it paid minimum wage. Knights will absorb a lower than usual profit margin, he said, without asking retailers to pay more at wholesale. Obviously, we'll have a higher cost, Mr. Boschett said, but we're pricing the product such that we're not asking the retailer or the consumer to sacrifice in order to support it. Knights plans to sell tees for $8 wholesale, with most retailers marking them up to $18. We think it's priced right and has a tremendous message. It's going to be marketed like crazy, says Joel Friedman, Vice President of General Merchandise at Barnes & Noble College Booksellers. He says Barnes & Noble will at first have some smaller than usual profit margins on the garments because it will spend heavily to promote them through a web campaign, large signs in its stores, and other methods. It helps to have many universities backing the project. Duke alone placed a $250,000 order and will run full-page ads in the campus newspaper, put postcards in student mailboxes, and hang promotional signs on light poles. Barnes & Noble plans to have Altagracious tees and sweats at bookstores on 180 campuses by September and 350 this winter, while Follett, another giant college bookstore operator, plans to sell the tees on 85 campuses this fall. Still, this new unknown brand could face problems being sold alongside Nike and Adidas gear. They have to brand this well, simply, clearly, elegantly, so college students can understand it very fast, says Kelly A. McGallany, a professor of corporate social responsibility at the University of California, Berkeley. A lot of college students would much rather pay for a brand that shows workers are treated well. Nike and Adidas officials said their companies have sought to improve workers' welfare through increased wages and by belonging to the Fair Labor Association, a monitoring group that seeks to end sweatshop conditions. A Nike spokesman said his company would watch with interest the Knights initiative. To promote its gear, Knights is preparing a video to be shown at bookstores and a web documentary, both highlighting the improvements in the workers' lives. The t-shirts will have hanging tags with pictures of Altagracia employees and the message, "Your purchase will change our lives." The tag will also contain an endorsement from the Workers' Rights Consortium, which has never before backed a brand. In a highly unusual move, United Students Against Sweatshops, a nationwide college group that often lambasts apparel factories, plans to distribute flyers at college bookstores urging freshmen to buy the Altagracia shirts. We're going to do everything we can to promote this, says Casey Sweeney, a leader at the group of Cornell. It's incredible that I can wear a Cornell hoodie knowing the workers who made it are being paid well and being respected. One such worker is Maritza Vargas. When BJ&B ran the factory, she was a Stand Up for Your Rights firebrand fighting for 20 union supporters who had been fired. Student groups in the Workers' Rights Consortium pressed Nike and other companies that used the factory to push BJ&B to recognize the union and rehire the fired workers. BJ&B relented. Today, Mrs. Vargas is president of the union at the new plant and sings a very different tune. In interviews, she and other union leaders praised the Altagracia factory and said they would do their utmost to make it succeed and grow. Maria Perez said the living wage would enable her to send her 16-year-old daughter to college, while Yolando Simon said she was able to pay off $300 of debt to a grocer. At other factories, workers said managers sometimes yelled or slapped them. Several said they were not allowed to go home when sick and sometimes had to work past midnight after beginning at 7:30 a.m. Comparing this factory with others, Mrs. Vargas said, "The difference is heaven on earth."